Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on ditching annual appraisals and mapping a clear path forward. I'm extremely excited to say we've had a record 1,500 registrations for this webinar. So I think that shows that this is clearly a subject for which people are looking for practical answers and a clear way forward. And hopefully Lucy and I are going to aim to give you that today. But first off, though, I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Lucy Adams.
Hi.
Hi, Lucy, welcome. Lucy, I'm sure, needs no introduction, but just in case, for those who don't know her, Lucy's CEO of Disruptive HR. She's a renowned HR thought leader, author of 2 best-selling HR books now, and a former HR director of the BBC. My name's Stuart Hearn and I'll be your host for this webinar. And to quickly introduce myself, I spent the last 20 years working in HR, specialising in performance management. So I've experienced it from both sides of the fence, both as an in-house HR director and a performance management consultant. I'm also incredibly passionate about the role that technology can play in performance management, which led me to found ClearReview, where I'm currently the CEO. Now, we're going to be making today's webinar interactive in a couple of ways. Firstly, we're going to be running 3 live polls during the session to gauge where the audience is at in terms of their performance management. So please have your mouse at the ready for those. We're also going to be having a live Q&A session towards the end. So please send in your questions via the webinar app during the webinar as it goes along. And we'll be picking a selection of those questions to pose to Lucy towards the end. So we're going to kick things off with our first poll question. So what we want to know is where you're at with your current performance management. So are you currently using annual appraisals, in the process of moving away from annual appraisals, or using a more continuous model of performance management? And we'll just give that a few seconds to come through, and we'll start looking at some of those answers in real time. Okay, so we're going to close the poll, and 52% using annual appraisals and 27% in the process of moving towards them. And what's interesting about that is we ran this poll, Lucy, a year ago, and there was 65% using annual appraisals at the time. So we're starting to see that transition take place.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it really is shifting now. I think it was, initially just a kind of few of the radical outliers that were doing these wacky things. But more and more now it's becoming, I wouldn't say the norm, but, definitely we're seeing a real shift.
Yeah, I think when we get above that, 50% of people not doing it anymore, that's when we can kind of think of it as more of the norm. So Lucy, I saw you speak at an event towards the end of last year, and I heard you say, is there a bigger crime that we've inflicted on our staff than the annual performance review? And that massively struck a chord with me. What's led you to have such strong views about annual appraisals?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a bit of hyperbole going in there. I'm not sure it's a crime, but I think we all know, we've all been on the receiving end of an appraisal. And for those of us who have managed people, we have all, put employees through it. And of course, if you're in HR, like most of the listeners today, then we know the kind of agonies of trying to get this thing done and, people complying with it. And, I just think that when you look at all of that misery that goes on, we just have no evidence that it improves performance, productivity, or motivation one iota. So, is it a crime? Possibly that was going a bit over the top. But I do think that we have inflicted a system on organisations that has, huge amounts of effort, huge amounts of investment, huge amounts of misery for absolutely no result, no positive impact. So yeah, I kind of stand by my views that in my experience as an HR director in numerous companies, as a leader myself, being on the receiving end of this, and now working with HR directors all over the world, nobody likes the annual appraisal.
No, and there can't be many things in management or in business generally that you put so much effort goes into with so little evidence that it works.
Exactly, right? It's a crazy thing, isn't it? Can you imagine, any other area of your organisation where, I think the stats that I had were that, 8% of organisations believed that they were worth the time and effort. Can you imagine any other area where they wouldn't be at least questions being asked?
Totally. I spoke at the CIPD Performance Management Conference recently, and I was also there the year before, and it's interesting to see the progression in debate. So 2 years ago, it was very much around whether or not we should get rid of annual appraisals, and the House was split. Last year in December, the debate really moved on to, we know they don't work, but what should we do instead, and how do we go about making that transition? Is that progression in thinking something that you've experienced, or are you still speaking to companies that are still very wedded to annual appraisals?
I find that there are still some companies who are wedded to the annual appraisal, not because they think it will necessarily improve productivity, performance or motivation, but because they believe they have to do an annual appraisal because it's what their leaders expect, and that line managers will not be capable of managing without it. And also the real biggie, that they have an annual bonus scheme, and how on earth will they pay their bonuses if they don't have a number and a rating to enable them to do that? So I very rarely, if ever actually, come across an HR director now who says to me, oh, you know, we stick with the annual appraisal because we think it's a good thing. The thing that's keeping them there is really trying to understand a way of moving, how they're going to move away from it, particularly getting managers to have frequent conversations and moving away from the bonus scheme.
Yeah, so some of those practicalities.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I remember in the early days when we started Clear Review, General Electric had just come out and said they were going to get rid of appraisals, and so famous for almost inventing the appraisal. And when they did, and the people I spoke to, it was almost this relief that we've always known appraisals didn't work, but it's okay to say it now, because some big companies have now said it's okay to say that too. You know, so
I mean, I think we're sitting here today overlooking Google's offices, and there is a real risk that it's only the kind of Silicon Valley mob that do this stuff. And so mere mortal organisations with normal budgets and normal type of people and normal business cycles and kind of think, oh, well, it couldn't possibly work for us. But of course, the exciting thing is, and I know you experience this as well, is that we now see public sector, engineering, professional services, retail, organisations that perhaps haven't been at the cutting edge of innovation in people practices now, in some ways leading the way, doing some really interesting stuff.
One of the things that you mentioned is something we hear all the time is these issues that people need to try and get past. So, okay, we want to get rid of appraisals, but they've got that fear of making that change. Do you think performance management, because it affects so many people feel like the stakes are higher with that than maybe just changing like an engagement survey or something like that?
Yeah, because as we know, performance management, the annual appraisal does feed a lot of other processes. So it feeds our reward process. It can feed sometimes our L&D process. It can feed our high potential talent management processes. So the idea of kind of extricating it from this tangled web of HR mess, I was going to say then, but extricating it out and looking at it in isolation can feel a little bit inadequate. And I get that, actually. I think that the more progressive companies are those that are not saying we're going to change our performance management process, but are taking a fresh look at how they're tackling the whole of their, how do they motivate their people, how do they increase the performance of their people, and so on. But let's also accept that sometimes that's all you've got the appetite for, and it can be done.
Yeah.
It really can be done. And hopefully we'll discuss how.
Exactly. I think it'll be a good time to look at our next poll now, because we talked about some of the things that are the problems that people are trying to get past with performance management. So what we've done here is listed what we think are some of the four of the most frequent ones that we hear in this poll question. So what we're asking the audience here is, what's your main concern when you think about transitioning away from annual appraisals to a more continuous type approach to performance management? So is it how to get managers to have more frequent and more meaningful conversations? I know that's a biggie for me when I speak to people, because people are so busy. How am I going to get managers to do this? How will I know? How do I get visibility of who's doing it? You mentioned, Lucy, how to handle performance-related pay. I know that comes up a lot. And how to get that senior level buy-in, because senior managers can often be wedded to appraisals, or think that ratings are actually a really great thing they can hang their hat on, when we know there's obviously some big problems around those. Okay, so we're going to see the results come in now. Okay, by far the most is how we can get managers to have those more frequent conversations. Does that surprise you at all, Lucy, or does that tie into some of the
No, it doesn't
conversations
surprise me at all, because that's why we started this business in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, we set up, what we wanted was for line managers and their employees to have a conversation about how they could do something better next week or increase their career prospects. But because we didn't trust managers to do it, so we put in place this massive framework, which became an industry, and then we introduced guided distribution and so on. And so, you know, I think that given that that was our primary motivation and we haven't achieved it, actually the idea of taking away a framework that, as you know, HR people will say to me, you know, at least it's better than nothing. At least they're having one conversation a year. I mean, I would suggest it's worse than nothing, actually, having one conversation a year. But nonetheless, there is a sense that actually at least it's achieving something that we failed to do. So I'm not surprised that that's the key reason.
I'm actually really encouraged to see that the main focus that people are wanting to put their effort into is how to get them to have those meaningful conversations. Because one thing that I've always found difficult to get my head around with performance management is that in many organizations, traditional performance management became the tail wagging the dog of performance and pay related decisions. So I can see it's a concern there, but it's not the primary thing that people are looking at, which I think feels like a progression in thinking, which is good.
Although I think slightly worrying for me is this idea of, you know, how will we know who is and isn't having regular conversations? And I think that need for HR to control and manage and own the process does keep us in some ways back in the kind of need of having a big process that we can tick people off. I don't mean tell them off, I mean, you know, tick off their compliance. Totally. And so that's you know, quite high, isn't it? That fear of how will we know, as opposed to focusing our efforts on creating the conditions where those easier, better conversations can happen.
Yeah, I think maybe where that concern comes from, I was at an event this morning and one of the speakers was talking about is that when they took the annual appraisal away, it kind of started to shine a light on the people that weren't great managers, that previously were hidden, because anyone can complete a form and return it to HR. But when we're asking employees, are you having meaningful conversations with your manager, it kind of is quite exposing, isn't it? So maybe that's where that comes from. Okay, Lucy, I'm going to hand the reins over to you now to give us a bit more on your take on performance management and appraisals.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, just thank you very much for inviting me along. You know, I mean, I've long been a fan of Clear Review, so it's great to actually be doing this together. And I'm going to just share some thoughts, really. First of all, about, rather than diving straight into performance management, is just to give some thoughts about HR and the way it's changing and some of the trends that we're seeing and some of the trends that we advocate. Kind of everybody knows this stuff about disrupted world, so I'm not going to go into the macro trends, but you know, we work with organizations pretty much in every sector, in many different geographies, and regardless of which sector they're in, regardless pretty much of geography, most organizations are looking for 4 things. You're looking for more agility, cope with the pace of change. They're people coming up with ideas, coping with things that are thrown at them, being able to change direction, manage competing priorities, and so on. Secondly, they're looking for more innovation. You know, this idea of we've got to disrupt the market, we've got to cope with market disruptors. They're looking for more collaboration because those geographical and departmental boundaries make less and less sense, either because of productivity pressures or because customers, clients just don't care where it comes from now. They just want the best possible experience, and certainly with digital, that need to cross that divide. And finally, productivity, you know, whether it be just more for less and increase efficiency, or because if you're in the likes of retail or public services, just, you know, massive financial pressures. So those 4, you know, agility, innovation, collaboration, productivity, these are the 4 things that every organization is going for. And you know, what have we got in HR to kind of help us with that? You know, we've got the HR manual. And the HR manual that was pretty much written in kind of 1980, 1990s, and includes things like the performance appraisal. And where we come from in disruptive HR is that HR manual just doesn't cut it anymore. Maybe it never cut it, but it's brought it into much, much sharper focus now, how kind of inadequate it is. And so what we advocate is an approach to rethinking fundamentally how HR is delivered, our relationship with our leaders, our relationship with employees, our role in the organisation, the things we do, and a fundamental change, not just changing our ratings from 5 boxes to 3, or doing our annual engagement survey a couple of times a year instead of once a year. So this is the model that we work with. For those people who know us and follow our work, then they'll be familiar with that. And I'm not going to go into detail, but just to touch on it in the context of performance management, we advocate a model called the EACH model, which talks about employees as adults, consumers and human beings. And the reason that this matters is that currently we treat people like children, which is, we don't trust your judgment, we don't trust you to behave properly. In terms of the consumer piece, currently we like to have one size fits all, and we treat our employees as a kind of homogenous lump, and we delight in our universal processes. And finally, the human piece, which is currently, I believe, in a lot of HR processes, and performance management is right up there, are not based around how human beings think, feel, behave, are intrinsically motivated. So just again to touch on those in terms of a performance management example, in terms of the adult piece, as I said earlier, so much of what we do in performance management, traditional performance management, is because we don't trust managers to have a conversation. So we take a very, very parental approach, which is, first of all, here's your process that you must comply with to these timeframes. Secondly, we expect you to lead your employee, not physically by the hand, but figuratively by the hand, sit them down in a room, give them lots of feedback, tell them how they're doing once a year, and then give them a rating in an incredibly parental way. It's like an end of school report, isn't it? What we're seeing is a move away from the parenting. Instead of designing stuff around not trusting people or not believing that people are capable of using their judgment, we're seeing a move to a much more adult. In performance management terms, this looks like the kind of Adobe model, which is, you're an adult, you work for us, we expect you to be interested in how you're performing, the contribution that you're making, how you're perceived by your colleagues. Therefore, it's up to you to own and manage that conversation. Line managers might tell you when they're available for those check-ins, but ultimately it's your responsibility. We're not going to do it for you. On consumer, this is recognizing that the idea of one process that hits all of the same time frames, that is the same for every single area of your business, when as human beings we all learn differently, our performance improvements come through different means at different time frames. We have different groups of employees that have very, very different needs. Some people have a very high need for regular feedback. Others actually don't really need or want that. Some people are much more inclined to kind of just do it for themselves and to self-reflect, and other people need more conversation. The idea that we would have one process that meets all of those needs. So we're increasingly seeing line managers being offered more choice about the approach that they can take, rather than it being one size fits all. And then finally, the human, and this ties into kind of where we started, which is that the idea that on a human level, I will be given feedback once a year, and that is going to make me immediately want to change my behaviours. I mean, we wouldn't do it with our kids, would we? You see your child needing some approval or a comment or a criticism, you think, right, I'm going to make a note of that and raise it with them in their 6-month review. I mean, it's just not human. The human brain can only cope with one piece of feedback at a time. So, and if you're going to have a chance of changing that person's views and feelings about their own behaviour, then that feedback needs to be done in a very effective way, done in a more regular way when the behaviour is evidenced, not sort of lumped together and done all in one go with the words, you know, can I give you some feedback, which, as we know, has the same impact on the human brain as someone running up behind you at night wearing a hoodie. Immediate shut. If we think about ratings, you know, if you follow the work of Marcus Buckingham, and I'm a huge fan of his, you know, line managers have rater bias. It's not that they're bad human beings, it's just that they are human beings. And so our ability to rate consistently and objectively is really very, very poor. And yet everything's based around this line manager rating. And then, of course, we know the human aspect of guided distribution. You know, line managers going, oh, you know, if it was up to me, I'd give you a 1, but HR only allows me 2 or 3 of these. And so we see this kind of gaming of the system and this complete abdication. So what we're seeing now is instead understanding how human beings behave, which is if they are going to respond to feedback, then it needs to be something that they have initiated by and large. So increased emphasis placed on the individual employee owning their own feedback. We see that the way that humans actually work is in teams rather than individuals. So we're seeing more and more emphasis on individuals kind of giving and receiving feedback in a team environment rather than just one-on-one. We know that actually the feedback I can get in a frequent check-in, undocumented, by the water cooler, 5-10 minutes, really powerful. You know, if line managers only did one thing and actually asked their employees once a week, what are you working on this week and how can I help? That would see performance improvements significantly greater than the effort that goes into a performance management system. So that's just a very, very quickly spoken snapshot of the EACH model, just to kind of give you a sense of what we're seeing. I should point out actually that, you know, the EACH model can be applied to obviously all of these areas, and there's a free diagnostic on our site if people want to have a look at that. So 4 reasons it isn't working. I'm not going to dwell on this because I think people just get that. You know, I'm going to assume that most people who've dialed into this have dialed in, shows my age, clicked into this, actually kind of get it. So we know that objectives are out of touch. You know, the idea that you set objectives in January and that they're still relevant in December. And also we know, because line managers will call me up as an HR person and say, have you got a copy of my objectives that I set for my team? I can't seem to lay my hands on them. Yeah, crazy. So I've talked about the fact that annual feedback done annually and done once is very often very bad. I don't like, as a human being, to be rated. Very rarely do people like to be rated. So actually they have a very negative impact. I've had great conversations with my team and then told them there are 2. And they go, well, I was a 1 last year, what's different? And I find myself kind of post-rationalising why they dropped down and they end up demotivated. It's crazy.
Yeah, or you get that conversation where people want to get a particular rating. You say, oh, you know that top one, no one's allowed to get that one. You know, I'm like, why is it on there? Well, no, but no one gets it. You know?
No one gets that. It's aspirational.
Yes.
It's a stretch target, which of course makes everybody feel great. And then, you know, you get the HR directors that kind of go, I get what you're saying, but I do need to have a system for poor performers, which, you know, you just have to stop and pause and look at the insanity of that. So you're going to apply a system that doesn't work, that everyone hates, that doesn't drive performance, productivity, or motivation 1 iota, costs you a shed load of money, lots amounts of time, but you're going to apply that to everybody to get to the 1 or 2% of people that might be behaving badly. Crazy. I used to work for a law firm, and our head of employment law used to say to me that never in his 20 years of being a top employment law partner had the annual appraisal system ever helped him in a tribunal for a company. In 20 years.
And it's funny, because I asked that same question of the head of employment law at another senior law firm, because I'd heard you mention that before, and I thought I'll ask him, and he said, not only that, but in many cases they make it worse. Yeah. Because people are rated, underperformers are rated satisfactory. So he said, actually, it makes it difficult for us.
When I was at the BBC, you go, you know, managers be going, I've got to get rid of them today. I've had 2 years of sheer hell with this individual. You'd go along and you'd go, right, well, have you got any documentation? Look at their appraisal form. You know, thanks for a stellar year.
Yeah.
That was my favourite. And you go, and what am I supposed to do with
that?
Okay, so we know it's not working. So what are we seeing is working? And obviously a lot of this is something that is built into clear review. Move away from annual. Don't only do individual objectives. Think about team objectives. Don't rate or grade your people. Definitely don't do forced or guided. And I wouldn't have 360 degrees part of a performance system. Jury's out for me, but some people still feel that there's a huge value of 360 degree in terms of people's development. We might have a conversation about that later, but as part of a systematic approach to performance management, I would drop it. Other stuff that I've mentioned, we're seeing, increasing employee ownership. The more the employee can own and drive this, the better. Companies I know that moved away from it being parental, top-down, and went to employee ownership said that initially it dropped off. People weren't rushing to own their own performance. Of course, these things take time. They take time. Team objectives, I think that, the best, and team reviews, that is, I think, one of the key areas that we can see some real performance gains. And again, employees having the confidence to reflect on their own performance. But the leader needs to be very good at facilitating that and beginning with self-criticism. One of the most high-performing teams I've ever seen was the News at 10 team at the BBC. Fantastic team review, and the editor would start by saying, you know what, I don't think I should have followed that Channel 4 story. I think I wish I'd gone with that, and it encouraged others to come through. Focusing on the conversations, I know that this is something that's dear to your heart as well, is let's really understand what good looks like, showing line managers that it doesn't have to be something that is weighty and hour-long. Get them started with just getting a bit of positive feedback, but a frequent check-in should be exactly that. It's a check-in, it's a couple of questions. It's not this mammoth thing that people are frightened of. The career conversations, even just calling it that. As a human being, I'd quite like a career conversation. I'm not sure I want a performance review. It sounds a bit judgmental and a bit clinical. But show line managers how they can get these kind of things going, and same with pay conversation, which can often be the one that can be quite that they can struggle. So I just want to finish on this. This bit of research came through from David Rock, who I admire a lot, and he was tracking Fortune 500 companies who had moved away from performance ratings and were moving into a different more quality conversations, frequent check-ins, much more fluid, much more agile. And I was just really struck by these numbers. They tracked these big organizations and they said, was it worth doing? 88% said it was worth doing, and 12% said it was too early to tell. But nobody said, I really wish we could go back to the old ways. And then you can see on the right-hand side just some of the other benefits, the other spin-off benefits. So yeah, I think, just to sum up, I think it does need a fundamental rethink before we dive in. The question is very rarely, we need to change our approach to performance management. It has to be something bigger and aligned to the business need. But I think it's exciting, and I think we're seeing now people doing different stuff and the world not falling apart, the world ending.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that's a really good insight into some of the things that people need to aim for. And I think, as you say, it's not something that we can just switch on and say, okay, A to B, off you go. It does need to be thought through. It is a bigger piece, but some of the things that I'll touch on later is, we can think of it as like a journey rather than a destination.
Yeah, we've been doing this stuff for 40, 50 years, for goodness sake. It's going to take a while.
Yeah.
Sometimes my clients will say to me, my boss has finally decided he wants to change performance management and he wants to introduce this, in the next 3 months. And you go, well, okay, but let's just try some different stuff. Let's pilot it. Give yourself a break. Equally, there are some people who are piloting it for their 4th year, and I think that's probably overkill.
Okay, yeah.
But let's kind of find a decent balance here.
But I think the other thing as well is, with before going into that change is reevaluating our success criteria. So the old days, it might have been 98% completion of appraisal forms. Well, that doesn't tell you if anyone's feeling motivated or had a good conversation.
No, exactly.
So, you know, as you say, that some of the stats might drop off depending on how you're looking at it. So people might say, well, I've got 50% of my people having conversations now. Well, actually, that might be better than you had before. Maybe you only had 10% before, but it was masked by this 98% form completion
and
rate.
let's be really clear, no matter what we do, if we've got really appalling line managers, none of this stuff is going to make them any better. You know, you might get a marginal improvement if they're able to ask a slightly different question. But this isn't going to fix bad management. What it does do is, instead of designing it around the poor managers and having a framework and a system, is it actually says, let's go with the people who might be, in the middle, the ones that with a slightly different approach could do something a bit better. So let's not kind of assume that this is going to transform our approach to management overnight. It really isn't. However, it does mean that we free people up to that have the potential to be a little bit better.
Yeah, so focusing on the people who actually do want to be good managers, because they're the people that we can work with. Okay, so we're going to have our third poll question now. We're going to ask this question about technology. So what best captures your feelings about use of technology for performance management? So either, I don't feel like we need technology, we need technology, but we haven't found the right solution. We have technology, but it's not doing the job. We've got a great solution in place. It's something that's close to my heart because, as you know, Lucy, I've had a background in HR and performance management, but more recently become quite fascinated with technology and the role that can play. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So it'll be interesting to hear what the views of our audience are on technology. I've got it. So we've got the results coming in now. Okay, so it seems like there's a good acceptance that people do need technology. Obviously, I've been getting out of conferences then, haven't I? And but they haven't found the right solution, or they've got technology that it's not doing the job. So the old clunky HR system still seems to be in force there. Is that anything in there that kind of surprises you?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, that must be music to your ears, Stuart. We need technology, but haven't found the right solution. Fantastic.
I am smiling.
I think my experiences of working with companies that if you're just going to take your broken process and chuck it over the fence and make it technology based, you're not going to get any different results.
No,
and that's one of the things I do like about Clear Review. And I have said this before, there is we do not get paid any sponsorship from Clear Review. We are product agnostic. But the reason I like it is that it looks at changing the approach and changing the mindset behind it, and then looks at the technology. And I think actually if you approach it that way, then technology can be a great enabler. It's not the only answer, though. It has to be part of an overall
absolutely approach. What we've tried to think about is what's the right approach and how can technology support that in terms of encouraging the right behaviors, nudging people, those kind of things, rather than, hey, let's build a system that looks swish and has loads of charts on that we can sell. It's not that's not what technology is about. What I thought would be useful to do is to spend a few minutes looking at a practical model around performance management, because the people that we speak to a lot, they get the concepts and they buy into all the things that you'd have just been saying and even the principles, but what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? So we've got this model here that people find quite helpful to look at. And you made the point about flexibility, Lucy. This isn't something that everybody follows in the same way, but all of the organizations that we work with use this model in some way or another. So it's based around having the check-in. Now, the frequency that they have these check-in conversations varies from one organization to the other. It varies within the organization in terms of the area of the business that you work in. What's the right cadence for you as an individual and a manager? One of the key things that we have done, as you know, is get rid of those horrible annual objectives that people write for HR and then get back to their day job. It's agile goals. What does that mean? It means goals that are nearer term. So something that you can actually tangibly work on that's going to make a difference. So typically 1 to 4 month time frame. You get there quicker, you feel more motivated. like you've said as well, we have got rid of the concept of the annual 360-degree feedback. I agree with you. I don't think that works in performance management. There's potentially a case in terms of leadership development, but in performance management, I don't believe it works. So we've replaced that with real-time feedback given in the moment, because if it's not given in the moment, then it gets to that stage where managers will say, well, it was a couple of months ago, now it's getting a bit awkward. I just won't give it. So if it's given as things happen, and we can use technology as an enabler to help that happen. Why? Because people are all over the place now. You get that situation where you've got an email saying, Dan did something fantastic, I'll tell him, oh, he's not at his desk, and then you forget. So technology can be a bit of an enabler for that. The other thing about this model is how do we answer the question of what do we do if we want to make decisions around pay and performance? Now, you'll see the dotted lines on here, and the key thing about our model is that those decisions and conversations are decoupled from those developmental check-in conversations. Why? Because I know that I'm not going to be honest about where I need to develop if I know that there's a rating coming at the end of that conversation that's going to affect my pay. So we keep them separate. We do it really quick and simply using technology, again, as an enabler. And again, we can call those pay conversations because that's what they are. So let's be clear that it's not an all-encompassing performance management conversation that's trying to do everything. We're kind of splitting it up. So we can still do all the things that we were trying to achieve with annual appraisals, but we're just doing it in a different way and at the right time throughout the year. So that's the concept, and that's the model. Does it work? Well, we believe it does. We're starting to get some really good evidence now to support this. And this is just some of the organizations that we've worked with over the last couple of years. I think we're over 150 now. And I think the takeaway from this is that if you keep that model flexible and you keep it simple, then it can work in pretty much any organization. It's sector agnostic. It's not something that only works in Google or or YouTube. I'd like to talk about a couple of the organizations in a bit more depth that we've worked with that I've found really interesting. So the first one being Clydesdale and Yorkshire Banking Group. They've got 6,500 employees, and I think in terms of a change process, I think it's one of the best culture change things that I've ever seen, because from a very negative place where they were at in terms of performance management previously, they got within 6 months pretty much everyone in the organization having some meaningful goals. Almost all of them had check-ins and 78,000 bits of feedback given in just that 6 months, which is incredible. And not every organization we work with has that, but they did a lot of things right. And I spoke to Francis, who's the head of OD there, and we've actually run a previous webinar with him. So if any of you are interested, go to our website and have a listen to that, because it's really interesting. The key learning for him is that they got out into the business and they talked and listened to as many people as they could. So he said, we talked to anyone who would listen to us. And they did that not just when they were consulting on what the new approach should be, but they kept doing that afterwards too. And the reason they did that is because they found that as the fear of change starts to kick in with managers, I'm going to have to do things I've never done before. Some of those same people that said, oh, we hated appraisals, started to say, well, actually, they weren't that bad, and they quite liked it. So they got out, and I think what was really came across from Francis and his team is that they empathized with those people. They didn't say, well, don't be ridiculous, it's going to be fine. They said, we understand that it's scary and it is different, and we're going to support you with the skills that you need. And they did some fantastic experiential training workshops to give people a safe environment where they could practice with actors, where they could practice having conversations, and just helping people to understand what's in it for them. We're doing this for you to make your life easier as a manager, because if your employees are more engaged and they perform better, you're going to have an easier time as a manager. So it is worth taking that time to do it. The other thing that they did, which I thought was really, really helpful, is that they had some bad experiences of a clunky HR tech, as most of us have when we worked in HR. So they showed the people our tech first, and they actually gave people a chance to play with it. So they could give some feedback, request it, have a check-in meeting before they actually launched. And that took away a lot of that fear that could have got in the way. We're a couple of years in now with them, and they've got their year-on-year employee engagement survey results, and they've had double-digit increases in employee engagement in terms of how people feel that they're being managed. So I think it's been really successful. Brilliant. Second case study I wanted to look at was the Valuation Office agency, and so very different organisation, public sector. And one of the things that we often hear HR professionals saying, and I think I understand why. I understand why they say this. They want to change the culture first, and then look at the processes and the technology second, which in one way makes sense. But then if the processes and technology are getting in the way of the culture change, that can actually hinder it. And that's what happened at the VOA. So they launched in 2016 with a new approach based around monthly coaching conversations. And it landed really well initially, yet they found that they just weren't getting the traction. It wasn't taking hold. And when they spoke to managers, they found that the requirements that sat alongside that, because they were there was some documentation required. It was go and use a Word doc, use this Excel thing to capture some of those objectives. Managers are saying, well, it's getting in the way. We find that we can't get access easily to the information to have a really good checking. So, what are your objectives again? Oh, they were on some spreadsheet I sent you last week. It just wasn't taking hold. So when they brought us in, what they found was that this fear that something like technology might get in the way of the conversations actually did the opposite. So just by giving people a simple set of prompts and of discussions to talk about, a few coaching questions to get them started, actually took away that fear of, well, what do I do? Do I just say, how are you? Yeah. I actually know what to talk about. And the system also helped them to have a culture of agreeing action points on the back end of a conversation, rather than just, we have a conversation, see you next month, oh, nothing has changed. It led to richer conversations because they had easy access to the goals and where people were at with them, and they could see the feedback that was coming in. So there was something tangible to talk about. So that's a couple of examples of where we've seen that the practicalities of having the framework and the technology actually making a difference. Before I finish about tech, I thought this is really interesting. Our director of product recently did an analysis of the data of 50,000 of our users over the last few months to see what it would unearth in terms of people's behavior. Now, I've always had this vision that tech can be a behavior catalyst rather than just somewhere to store data in. And what we found was that when people had a check-in conversation in ClearReview, they were 33% more likely to give or request some feedback within a week after that. And then that action then of receiving feedback or giving it had a resulting behavior increase on the next check-in conversation. So they were 48% more likely to have a higher quality conversation based on around that they were agreeing more actions to take on the back of that. So what we're starting to see is this kind of flywheel effect, where the conversation is feeding feedback, which is feeding the conversation. And then so it goes on, and you start to embed a real behavioral change. But using technology is that thing that kicks it off. So we found that, it's really interesting findings that we're getting. Lots of exciting things about the future of tech as well, which we're just starting to explore about, can technology start looking at some of the qualitative things that people are saying, so we can start drawing out themes for the organization from feedback. So this is all stuff that AI is going to help us do just this year. So exciting times ahead. I'd like to finish my bit just on this quote that I alluded to before about this feeling that because performance management affects so many people, it feels like this too hard to do category. But actually, we don't have to fix every single thing and all the knock-on processes in one hit. We can view it as a destination, as a journey rather than a destination. I think you made the point when we were chatting before that we can do that. We still need to know where we're going on that journey. So we've got to be clear about what that final thing might look like. But we don't have to get there in one hit. We can take a more agile approach.
And I don't think you have to be clear about the end process.
No.
I think you have to be clear about the experience you want your people to have and how you want them to feel about it.
And what success would look like.
Exactly. And if you have that as the creative challenge or the question, then it's perfectly fine to pilot things and try stuff out and perhaps to get things wrong and chuck that bit away and within reason. Obviously, we don't want to confuse the hell out of our managers all the time. But I agree with you. I think you have to be clear about sort of what you want it to look, what you want it to feel like, and you can then test out different.
And iterate over time, just that agile approach of trying out, different questions that you might want to encourage people to talk about in check-ins. A few of our customers are now starting to include well-being questions into their check-ins. They didn't do that from day one, but it's evolving. Now they've got the habit of conversations taking place. We can start asking people to include more in those conversations.
You mentioned the new book, and one of the things we talk about there is adapting processes and approaches from agile product design, marketing, and so on, and applying them to what we do in HR. And I think that example of a rolling launch that you would absolutely expect in tech, why aren't we thinking that way? You know, it doesn't all we have to be so perfect with our frequently asked questions answered, unions squared away.
The toolkit.
Yeah, absolutely, everything perfect. And actually, I think it's much more energizing and makes much more sense if we're looking at this iterative process.
Yeah. Okay. So in the last 10 minutes or so, we've got time for some questions. So you've been sending in your questions throughout the webinar. We've got some great ones coming in. So if you can keep those coming in as well as we talk. So my colleague here has curated a few questions for me to ask you. So how do we measure how individuals are doing, and therefore how to develop and reward them without a process to do this?
So I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is how can we measure people's performance? And the second one is how can we reward people commensurate with our view of their performance? So let's deal with the first one first, the first part, which is, you know, how can we measure performance? And there is an argument, and it's not an appealing one, it's not an attractive argument, because we love certainty, and our board loves to know that we can box all our people away in terms of, you know, how well performing or otherwise they are. But there is an argument to suggest that apart from our, you know, business outputs, our budget, our financial results, etc., actually, it's very difficult to measure performance.
Very hard.
Very, very difficult to measure performance. It's very difficult to say, because if you've got a line manager judgment, we know that they're subject to rate of bias. So actually, the ability to get consistent, objective, and calibrated ratings, even with painful calibration sessions. So I think we kind of have to ask ourselves the question: do we need to measure performance? If we believe that line managers are comfortable that they are delivering what is needed to be delivered, if they believe that individuals are motivated and trying their very best and, you know, achieving what it is that is asked of them, actually, is that enough? If as an individual I'm asked, how do I think I'm performing, and I'm showing an interest and I'm curious in learning and growing and getting better, kind of that is pretty much all we can hope for, really. So are we comfortable? You know, I used to put forward performance graphs to my board. You know, so many people are at level 5, so many people are this, so many people are at that. It was meaningless. It was absolutely meaningless. So I think we have to challenge ourselves: can we measure individual performance? And should we be wasting huge amounts of energy on that? The second piece, though, is about how can you then pay an end of year bonus if you haven't got a rating. So just break that down a little bit. We kind of have a view, don't we, that because, you know, if I rate you a 2, that somehow that is nice and objective and clinical and it's been calculated, and whereas of course all it is actually a reflection of my judgment. Mm-hmm. I have judged you to be a 2. So let's not fool ourselves and say that what we've got are objective measures. What we've got is line manager judgment arriving at a number. So what organisations are doing, if they're getting rid of ratings but keeping the bonus, they've got 3 choices, and they're not mutually exclusive. They can do consistent assessment. So in sales organisation, mm-hmm. that can work very well. In project-based organisation, consultancies, for example. So you're kind of continually assessing that person's, in terms of their likely pay output bonus. Now, most organisations, you said to line managers, we want you to assess continually, they're going to die. The second one is a kind of calibration of, so instead of wasting your energies getting line managers in a room trying to debate whether someone in their team is a 2 or a 4 or a 3, is actually to get them to debate and discuss the output in terms of the bonus and the pay that these individuals should be getting. Mm-hmm. Much richer conversation, because you're taking into account future market rate, market value, you're taking into account what matters to them as an individual.
Risk of leaving, things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Much richer conversation rather than focusing on the number of the rating. And then the third element, which is what the vast majority of organisations do, is you allow a line manager discretion. Mm-hmm. And you allow line managers. Now, actually, given that they're giving a rating at the moment which drives the bonus, you're just cutting out the middleman and you're doing exactly what you're doing.
It's a more
today.
honest approach, and
it is.
I like it. I saw a senior executive at GE say that it was ridiculous before they switched to a manager discretion approach, because they could make a decision on whether or not to build a multi-billion-pound power station, but not decide on a 1 to 1.2% pay increase for one of their members of staff. Can you imagine?
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I've been there with my managers. Yeah.
Okay. How would you recommend handling stakeholder fears regarding the receipt of constructive feedback by both the appraisee and the appraiser? Can the organisation be prepared for this without training? So, yeah, this fear about, we see a lot about, well, once I open up the can of worms and all this feedback starts getting out, you know, is that going to cause massive problems in my organisation?
I mean, I think it's probably a question for both of us. My experience is that just doesn't happen.
Same with me.
Really doesn't happen.
Comes up every time I go to a board meeting on a master come and present. They say, yeah, but everyone's going to start asking feedback. It's going to get really awkward. It never does.
No, they don't actually. And I think it's about trying to, again, show line managers, leaders, HR teams, employees, that this is about on the job. It's not something special. It's not a big sit down piece. You know, we talk about, well, at the moment it's hard enough for me to find an hour to have an end of year appraisal with somebody. How on earth am I going to be doing this on a weekly or a monthly or even quarterly basis? Well, because you're doing it whilst you're walking to that meeting, or you're sitting down over a quick cup of coffee, or you're at their desk, and you kind of shrink it right down. So I think these fears are certainly in my experience, and it sounds like yours as well, are completely unfounded.
Yeah.
That's not what happens. So I think if they need evidence, presumably they can come to you and you can.
Yeah, well, quite often the only solution is when it's I go to a board and they'll say, of 150 organisations, this never happened. So that's all you can do, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's I think a really good point. You know, if we are expecting our HR teams to be more pioneering, they can't expect to have all of the stats to prove this works. You know, sometimes a client will say to me, you know, oh, I really get this, and you know, whether it be talent or engagement or whatever it is we're doing with them, I really get it and I want to move, but can you give me loads of case studies and benchmark data and analysis to prove that this works perfectly? Well, no, we can't, because actually you're trying to do something that's a bit different. Yeah. But kind of use your common sense as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. How do you get an aged mindset board converted to a modernized approach? I love that question. How do you get an aged mindset board converted to a modernized approach?
Yeah,
you experience that kind of board?
Yeah, absolutely. And you very often get leaders that are either not interested, or they think, well, it's working, why on earth do we need to change? Or they were on the receiving end of the top bonuses and the top ratings when they were growing up, and so they think it's a good and a positive thing. So what I would advocate is, first of all, try not to go for business case of what's not working and what you want to do in one go. Do it in a couple of stages. So in the first instance, build a business case which is just asking for permission to explore how it might be different and what else is out there. Most boards are comfortable with agreeing to that, if not the second stage initially. So don't try and do it in one go. Secondly, back to my consumer mindset piece, they will all have different reasons for objecting to it. What we tend to do, and I've been so guilty of this myself, is I write a board report, one business case, and I try and use loads of data and a compelling argument, and I put it there, and actually each of them were very different. So some of them loved the shock and awe data. You know, Deloitte's famously used the 2 million hours being spent. I mean, super smart, great piece of shock and awe data by their HR team. One figure that actually got people taking notice because they sell their hours. So of course they're going to wake up. I know another Big Four firm, they did a piece of analysis that found that 75% of their people had the same rating for the last 5 years or more. That was enough to get people to at least go, something's not quite right here. Yeah. For others, though, you need lots of stories and anecdotes that appeal to their own personal experience. You need some quotes from your millennials, your high performers, for others, it's about telling them that the competition's already doing this.
Yeah.
You know, my chief exec in one of my organisations, I was about to say which one it was, but will remain nameless, the most competitive person I have ever met, and I think on the planet. All the stats in the world would have been less interesting to him than the fact that our main competitor were already doing this stuff. He would have been like, right, get there first, let's do it. So the point I'm trying to make is that, again, one size doesn't fit all with this board. It's not that they're all in the same place with the same mindset. They will all have different reasons for doing it or being objecting to it. And I think we have to be a bit more granular and a bit more sophisticated about how we appeal to them.
Totally, great stuff. We've got one last question. How important do you think it is for performance management to be aligned to strategic priorities? Because it always has been, well, we've always tried to do that traditionally, you know, say here's the goals of the organisation, go off and
cascade.
Yeah, so
I remember one guy coming to me at the BBC and saying to me, Lucy, I have 85 objectives. And that was because we'd done the classic cascade, and by the time he'd kind of collected as he went further down the organisation, his division, his department, his team. Then he got his own individuals, and it was in objectives, and it was around, you know, actually what he needed to achieve, business as usual. Then one's added on, then behavioural. Then we added on some health and safety, some diversity, some finance, and so on.
It's like pyramid selling, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fallacy that we are able to have this perfectly neat organizational model and hierarchy of cascaded objectives. Life is not like that. You may get some that you can take to a team level, but ultimately our objectives need to be much more agile, much more frequent, much more of a sense of me doing my job better, because that's ultimately what motivates people to do their jobs better, and that's what performance management is about. And so instead of ending up with these slightly spurious cascaded objectives that may or may not have something to do with your everyday work, keep them small, granular things that people can do and achieve within a relatively short time frame, which it's kind of cascade in reverse. If everybody is doing that within a broad overarching framework of kind of what we're trying to do as a business, surprise, surprise, you actually perform better.
Yeah, I like to call that upwards aligning. So let employees lead, they know what's important to them, as long as the organisation is making it clear what is important to the organisation, and that doesn't have to be in some cascade process. It can be, you know, roadshows, internal comms. But if those strategic objectives are communicated in a way that people can understand and buy into, they will know what to do.
I mean, there's a big kind of movement which is actually about the leadership setting a kind of direction and a sense of purpose, and then allowing teams and individuals a much greater level of autonomy.
Yeah.
You take away the kind of rating element, people are much more likely to set themselves stretch targets, stretch objectives. So your point about, what did you call it? About
upwards aligning.
Upwards alignment, much more effective in my experience.
Yeah. Okay. That's the end of the Q&A. So it's pretty much all we know. Me too. I know. We'll carry on afterwards. We'll go in the pub and we'll carry on putting the world to rights. Just before we finish up, I just want to say that we've got some ebooks and webinar recordings on this subject. So we're going to have a follow-up email. I was going to send you some information on that. We've also got 7 copies of your new book, Lucy, to give away. So in that email, there's going to be I'm told, a simple performance management question. I didn't write it. And the first 7 people to respond to that email with the right answer are going to get a copy of your book.
Lovely.
And finally, we are compiling the first UK performance management report this year. And as part of that, we're going to be running a survey in a couple of weeks' time. So we'd love if all the people here who have tuned into this could participate in that. So please keep an eye out for that survey. But it remains for me to thank you so much, Lucy, for joining me.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you here, and to thank everyone who's tuned in today, and have a great rest of the day.